Good morning and welcome to our presentation on alcohol and other drugs in the workplace. This is an education awareness session presented by Fit for Duty. My name is Scott Osborne. We've been around for a little over 20 years. We provide drug and alcohol testing on site in workplaces. We also provide on site drug and alcohol education and safety presentations. We also provide this form of recorded session, and we can provide sessions remotely as well via either Zoom or Teams or any other platform, really. So our focus is on enhancing workplace safety. So in that, we potentially come at this from a little bit of a different sort of approach to what other people may do who are in our industry. We come from a health and safety background as opposed to enforcement type background. Very key to this is that we are not about finding positive results. Now that needs some context, obviously. So if our science is correct, so the devices we use are accurate, all of those sort of elements are in place, the scientific elements for accurate testing. If those things are in place, if the compliance elements are correct. So in other words, we are compliant with the Australian standards or the New Zealand standards as may be. All of those elements are in place. So the compliance elements, the regulatory elements are in place. And if, when we're performing a selection of candidates for testing, we are selecting in an equitable fashion across a whole organisation. So we're getting a good cross-section of the organisation. So if all of those things are in place and we're still not finding positive results, then we see that as a big tick. We've won. Okay. We've done our jobs. That's what we're actually here about, is to sort of create an environment in which it's safer for everybody, because we're not actually finding positive results. It means that the drugs theoretically shouldn't be actually present in the workplace. So you're never going to, it's highly methodical, the way that we approach this. You're never going to find us involved in sort of witch hunts and gotcha moments and that sort of thing. That's not what we do. We want to create an environment in which people can make a good, informed decision about when they might use a substance. And we're not naive. We understand that people do use particular substances that may impair their ability to do particular types of work. We want to create an environment which actually deters people from doing that, but also creates then in them behaviour change such that they may still choose to use a particular substance, whether it's alcohol or a drug of some form. They might do that, but they actually make a decision on when they might do it such that it's not coming into the workplace. So I'm going to give you, hopefully today, the tools that will help you to actually ensure that you don't actually take those things in a way that they come into the workplace. And the ultimate outcome of that is, of course, better safety for everybody. Okay, so that's what we're about. We assert that we're a quality provider, and I guess anyone in this industry or in virtually any industry is going to assert that they're a quality provider. So we put things in place within our three organisations to ensure that every aspect of what we do fits within a quality framework, fits within safety and environment. They're very important aspects of what we do. Ensure that we're good corporate citizens, but also we also work within a testing certification from National Association of Testing Authorities, NATA. We also are accredited through NATA for performing testing of urine and oral fluid. And also our training organisation, which trains all of our collectors and indeed trains many collectors throughout the industry and all industries. That's a registered training organisation. It's under the VQF framework, so the Vocational Quality Framework education section. So, every aspect of what we do is we're sort of aiming for that, high quality of work, high quality of care for the information and data and all those sort of things that are given to us by our people we work with. These things are really important to us to ensure that everything we do, it gives you some sense of comfort that we're doing things the right way. I'm going to talk to you briefly today about some safety stats. I'm not going to bore you with that. There's one slide, but it is fairly hard hitting. So I do encourage you to have a good look at that. We'll talk a bit about drug types and their effects, why we might test for those things. I'll talk to you about behavioural changes. I want to put a little bit of a wrapper around that because, again, in the spirit of no witch hunts, I don't want people sort of, going and actually sort of examining people for particular behaviour changes. The actual focus here is if you see, you work with people on a day-to-day basis, you know these people that you're working with. If you see a behaviour change, that you give some consideration to, are you okay? Having a good conversation with that person and endeavouring to ensure that, those people have the best possible support that they can get. So that's why we look at behavioural changes. And part of that package of things that might sort of come out of a behaviour change is that we might perform testing, but that's not the primary focus. The focus is on that person's safety. I'll go into more detail on that when we, of course, get to that slide. I will give you information around detection periods. Obviously, you need to know how long a drug or alcohol stays in your system. That's really important because you need to be able to come to work without those substances in your system. So if you know how long they're likely to stay in your system, you've got that sort of information so that you can choose when and where and how and all those sort of things. You might, take a particular a substance. Of course, and I'm sure you've heard them, there's a million and one myths. I'm going to try and debunk at least a few of those for you. Questions wise, normally in a live session, I throw it open for questions at any time during the sort of discussion. Obviously, we're not able to do that, but what I can do is direct you to our website, fitforduty.com.au. And if you go on there and go to the inquiries section, if you type in an inquiry there, you can anonymise it as much as you choose to. Obviously, you'll need to leave us some way to contact you. But if you send through an inquiry on that, my team or I will actually see that and be able to respond to that question. Okay, this is the statistics slide, and as I said, it's fairly hard-hitting. So, for example, in 2020, there are 194 worker fatalities. Statistically, at least 50 of those involved drugs or alcohol. The 50 people didn't get to go home to their families as a result of drugs or alcohol. That's pretty disturbing, quite sad, because the reality is that whilst every death in the workplace is preventable, there's somewhere in that chain of events that led to that passing of that person that we could have intervened. When it comes to drugs or alcohol, it's really easy to intervene. We just don't bring those into the workplace. So, 50 people who didn't go home could have gone home. Similarly, in the 2018-19 year, there were financial year, there were 114,000 reported serious work cover claims. We're not talking scratches, we're talking serious work cover claims, potentially life-changing. And 1 in 4 of those were drug or alcohol related. Okay. Again, that's pretty heartbreaking. That means that 30,000 people roughly were injured in the workplace that didn't need to be injured. I mean, all of these are preventable, I get that. But drugs and alcohol are very easily prevented in the workplace. 75% of illicit drug users are actually employed, okay? 75%. So the majority of people who use drugs are actually in the workplace. 80% of heavy alcohol users are employed. So when we're talking heavy alcohol use, the most recent definition of that is if you're a gentleman, 4 standard drinks a day, and we'll talk about what a standard drink is. It might not be what you think it is. So 4 standard drinks, 4 standard alcohol drinks a day, and you need to have at least 1 or 2 alcohol-free days a week. If you're exceeding those levels, you would be considered a heavy alcohol user. If you're female, then it's 2 standard drinks a day, again with 1 or 2 free in a week, 1 or 2 free days in a week. Now, I'm not being sexist by saying that. Women have different enzymes in their stomach for how they process alcohol than men. So men there's also physiological things around height and weight and, you know, those sort of physical things. But in general, biological women have uh, enzymes, different enzymes in their stomach that lead to a different way that they process alcohol, and such that if you're exceeding 2, you're considered a heavy alcohol user, if you're a female. All right. Drugs fall into, including alcohol, fall into one of 3 categories. We've got hallucinogens, stimulants, and depressants. Hallucinogens, we typically don't test significantly for in the workplace. We'll test for ecstasy because it's an amphetamine type substance, but we're not typically testing for LSD or psilocybin or, you know, shrooms, magic mushrooms. And the predominant reason for that is if you're seeing things, hallucinogen, if you're seeing things, then, you know, it's going to be pretty obvious. You're not going to need a testing organization to come in and test for that person. That person needs to probably be got to a hospital, certainly out of the workplace because it's unsafe. So from that perspective, there's no necessity to test. Whereas stimulants and depressants, they're not quite as obvious. And yeah, we need to test for those things. So stimulants are going to be amphetamine type substances. Cocaine sort of is an amphetamine type substance, but we do call it out as a little bit different. So we're going to be talking about methamphetamine, amphetamines, ecstasy, MDA, and cocaine. They're the predominant stimulants. And the result of a stimulant is, they were designed predominantly for war. So they increase aggression, they increase confidence to unsafe levels. Those are the sort of things that are going on there. So you'll get somebody who's driving a forklift who in an overconfident state will tend to drive faster than they should, and with less regard for other people's safety. That's the sort of thing you're talking about there. On the other hand, you've got depressants. So depressants are going to be alcohol, cannabis, and generally opiates. So a depressant is something that's going to slow down your reaction time and tend to make you less sort of aware of your surroundings in that regard. So the risk there with depressants is that, of course, in a safety sensitive environment, you need to have your wits about you. So you don't want to be overconfident, but you don't want to be sort of, for want of a better word, dopey. You need to be really sort of with it. So neither of these are great in a safety sensitive environment. So let's talk about the specific sort of drugs and alcohol that we test for. So of course we do test for alcohol, and you would think in this day and age that we would tend not to sort of find too much alcohol in the workplace, given DUI stuff on the side of the road, all that sort of stuff. We do. We still find it on sort of a startling regular sort of basis. And ultimately, in many respects, it's people who sort of have had a fair bit of alcohol, and we'll talk about sort of how long it takes to exit the body. But, they've had a fair bit of alcohol and they come to work still with a reasonable amount in their system. So that's a fairly common thing. On the other hand, we also find really common, reasonably low levels, but unsafe levels still of marijuana. So generally speaking, and of course, medicinal marijuana is still marijuana, and it's still going to give you difficulties performing your duties. But there's a whole framework around which we have to deal with that, because it's not an illicit substance necessarily. I mean, it can be, if it's not prescribed. So there's a whole process there that we need to sort of go through to sort of establish, what level you've got in your system, and are you safe to perform work. And in general, it's generally considered that it's not safe to have any level of any level of marijuana in your system. So yeah, we're testing for alcohol, we're testing for marijuana. Obviously, we test for methamphetamines and amphetamines. There was a period there where methamphetamine was probably the most detected drug after marijuana and alcohol. Less so these days. Unfortunately, it's swapped over more to cocaine. Methamphetamine, in some respects, the data sort of suggests that people were taking a lot of amphetamines, and then they swapped over to methamphetamine, which was kind of the new drug on the block at that stage. But now it appears that they've migrated to using cocaine. As I say, methamphetamines and amphetamines, they were designed for war and to increase aggression and overconfidence and things like that. not a good situation in a safety sensitive environment, certainly not good for, workplace relations and that sort of thing. You don't want someone who's perpetually angry, that sort of thing. So we test for meth and amphetamines. As I say, cocaine's kind of picked up a lot. We do see a lot more of cocaine than we used to. The interesting part with cocaine is that actually cocaine breaks down very quickly within a space of, of hours, not many hours either. So if we detect raw cocaine, it generally means that you've taken it within the last, say, 2 hours. Okay, so it breaks down really quickly to benzoecgonine and ecgonine methyl ester. These days we test for benzoecgonine, which is a metabolite of cocaine. If I find benzoecgonine, it generally means that and no cocaine, it means that you've taken it sort of more than a couple of hours ago. So if I get a result for raw cocaine at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I know you've had it somewhere between 8 and 10 a.m. And if I get you at work, there's a good chance you've actually taken it at work. So in that regard, I can be fairly precise with what I've discovered. And the other things we test for is opiates and oxycodone. So need to bear with me a little bit here. I need to explain metabolism a little bit. So generally speaking, opiates, when they break down in your body, break down to morphine. They'll have other little markers, codeine, for example. So if you've taken codeine, we'll discover morphine out on site. And when it goes to the lab, that'll come back and it'll confirm that you've had codeine and morphine. So if you actually sort of disclose to me or to my collector that you've taken something that contains codeine and you've got a prescription for that, which is required these days, all good. That's exactly what we need to know. And you'll be able to go back to work, provided you can sort of make a medical declaration, produce the prescription within sort of a period of time, usually 24 hours, something along those lines. And it's all good. You're safe to work. The other the difficulty we have there is morphine's sort of the single largest metabolite, and so it's easy for us to detect in oral fluid in particular, but also in urine. Unfortunately, there's a little marker for heroin that we don't typically see on site because it's very small. So the devices, whilst they're pretty sophisticated, they're not sophisticated enough to get down to the levels that we need to find 6-monoacetyl morphine. So when we see 6-monoacetyl morphine, we know you've taken heroin within typically the last 48 hours, something along those lines. So we're looking for that little marker. We can't find it on site, hence we get things like codeine and that sort of thing, because the biggest metabolite we're looking for is morphine. Once it goes off to the lab, if the lab comes back, you've told me, I've taken codeine, we get a report back from the lab. There's no trace of codeine, but there's morphine and there's 6-monoacetyl morphine. I know that you've been less than truthful. Let's say you haven't taken codeine, you've taken heroin, and you're trying to kind of mask it. And there could be a whole heap of explanations behind that, but fundamentally, if you've got 6-monoacetyl morphine in your system, you've taken heroin at some point in the last 48 hours. Oxycodone was a drug that was added to the standard in the last, 2019, when the new standard came out for oral fluid testing. Oxycodone is a synthetic drug. When it breaks down to hydromorphone, so we don't discover it using a morphine test. We have a separate test for that, so we're testing for hydromorphone. So oxycodone, the reason it was introduced to the standard is that there's a significant number of deaths attributable to abuse of oxycodone, and so therefore it needs to be tested for, because it's not safe in the workplace. It's a depressant, but also because ultimately it can actually lead to your death. Again, if you've got a prescription for endone, which is oxycodone, you just simply need to let us know about that. Obviously, the toxicologists will actually examine the levels and sort of try and determine, at least within some degree of accuracy, are you actually overusing the drug? Are you using it in accordance with your prescription? So that's what we're looking for there. All right. When I was a young bloke, the advertising for government advertising around alcohol was, if you're a guy, 2 standard drinks in the first hour and 1 thereafter, and that'll keep you under the 0.05. And if you're a lady, 1 standard drink in the first hour and one thereafter. They don't seem to sort of advertise that way anymore, and probably with good reason, and I'll sort of show you that. Generally speaking, so blood alcohol concentration and breath alcohol concentration are roughly equivalent. They're pretty close. And it's actually fairly difficult to sort of determine which way it'll go if you actually do a blood test. But breath alcohol is actually accepted as a measure, and if you exceed that particular measure, so it might be 0.02, it might be 0.05, or it might be a flat zero, depending on where you work and what your company policies are, and etc. So in essence, if you exceed those thresholds from a breath alcohol perspective, that's a given within your policy that there are consequences for that. A standard drink of alcohol is 10 grams of alcohol, okay? And that in a male is going to be roughly equivalent to 0.02, right? So one standard drink in a male will lead you to a 0.02 level when you're driving, for example, and you get breathalyzed. For a female, that's going to be 0.03. And that's because your body started to process it. So for a guy, when you have that second drink of a standard drink of alcohol, that'll actually take you to 0.045, all right? Because the second drink kind of has to queue up behind the first one. And once that's finished processing, then you can get your second one in, right? So what's the level if you're driving? 0.05. And 2 standard drinks for an average guy is going to lead you to a level of 0.045, right? So you can see why the government probably stopped advertising that you could get away with 2 standard drinks in the first hour, because if you're not an average guy, say you're a little bit more petite than the average guy or something along those lines, you're going to have a difficulty because you're probably going to go over the 0.05. For females, that first standard drink will take you to 0.03. The second standard drink will take you up around 0.07. All right, so you can see why the government advertising used to say, no, you can't go over 2 standard drinks in the first hour. You can't have more than 1 standard drink in the first hour because you're going to go over. Okay, so that's. I'll show you this a little bit more on a graph shortly, but it just sort of, that's the conceptual thing. So for a guy, first standard drink 0.02, second standard drink 0.045. For a female, first standard drink 0.03, second standard drink 0.07. So it was a very rough guide, so these aren't sort of set in stone, but that's roughly what you're looking at. It's going to be highly affected by your diet, your gender, your body size, and your general health condition, especially around your liver. But there's also things where, you can be a really fast metabolizer of alcohol. I actually happen to have that gene, and so I do process alcohol very quickly. Whereas other people, they might process it a little bit more slowly. They might get higher peaks. There's all sorts of things that go on there. So be really careful with that. The only real way you're ever going to know, frankly, is to either own a breathalyzer, don't get a cheapy semiconductor device. They're only good for a couple of tests. Get a fuel cell device, typically talking somewhere from about $250 up in Australia. But that's sort of your rough limits. So that's sort of the rough advice on the device that you should get. Either that, if you're drinking at a establishment, have a look around, see if they've got a wall-mounted device, figure out if it's been recently calibrated. You'll need to probably ask the bar staff or something along those lines. Make sure you breathalyze yourself, because there's really no way to know without a device to measure you. You can actually get little disposable devices. If you go to our health equipment business, drug and alcohol testing equipment.com.au, we'll have that those devices on there. I think they're about $12 a go, something along those lines, and they're a pretty good solid little device. They'll at least give you sort of, are you over 0.02, right? So at least then you know how much you are at. Ultimately, the best advice I can give you is, if you're not at home and you're drinking, don't drive. Find some other way to get home. That's the most safe way to be. Okay. So what's a standard drink? We could talk about pots, but I'm not sure that too many people actually drink pots. Sometimes people use them in a shandy, I think, but ultimately, people tend to drink schooners, stubbies, or cans of beer, and they're 375 mils. So for a full strength drink, That's 1.5 standard drinks. Now, remember what I said about heavy alcohol use? For a lady, that's going to be 2 standard drinks a day. For a guy, that's 4 standard drinks a day. So for a guy, we're talking just over 2 stubbies, okay? That take you to 3, so just under 3 stubbies, all right? For a lady, basically just under 1 stubby, okay? Just over 1 stubby. So, full strength alcohol, 1.5 standard drinks in 375 mils. Medium strength is going to be one for one standard drink for one mid strength beer, and light beers, 0.8 standard drinks. Okay. Spirit nips, 30 mils, 1 standard drink. Premixed spirits, be really careful with this one. We're saying 1.5 standard drinks because on average that's true, but it can be as much as 2.3. I think there's a drink called Devil's Cut, something like that. I think it's 2.3. So you're going to get a whole range there. So be really careful with that one. And yeah, so that's pre-mixed spirits. If somebody else is mixing it for you, if you're over at a mate's place, just be careful that he hasn't or she hasn't given you half and half, and in a dessert glass. So, then all of a sudden all of that goes out the window. Bottle of spirits is typically 22 standard drinks. Alcoholic shots, alcoholic soda, 1.2 standard drinks. They tend to be sweeter but lower levels. And also they can be sort of 300 ml too. And then you get your ports and sherries and things like that. The one I think that catches a lot of people out is just a glass of wine. A glass of wine is actually a really significant amount of alcohol. So 1.8 standard drinks in an average restaurant serve of wine. So not your dessert glass type. We're talking an average restaurant serve of wine is 180 mils, and that's going to be 1.8 standard drinks. A bottle of wine, somewhere between 7 and 9 standard drinks, depending on how strong the alcohol is in it. So typically, a lot of wines these days are more like 14%, but you still get, your average ones at around 12. So this is actually a study that was performed back in the 1970s. It probably wouldn't get up on a ethics committee these days. Alcohol's a known carcinogen. Feeding people alcohol is not a good idea. But back in the 70s, obviously, things might have been a little bit looser, and so they were able to perform this study. It was on male subjects, so I'll try and sort of give you, for females, the equivalents in some degree, but ultimately, adult fasting male subjects, and they chose 8 people, and they gave them alcohol, and then they measured them at regular intervals over a space of time, and graphed, how long it took on average for alcohol to clear their system. So male subjects, the first standard drink takes them to 0.02, and roughly speaking, it's going to clear out of your system somewhere around 3-hour mark. So if you've got a requirement to have zero alcohol in your system, it's going to be 3 hours to clear out of your system. Probably for most breath detection devices, we're talking 1.5 to 1 hour 45 minutes for detection. Most breathalyzers aren't going to get right down to those minuscule amounts. This is sort of laboratory testing that this was performed in. In the field, we're not likely to see it sort of after about an hour and a 45, something along those lines. 2 hours for safety's sake. Remembering this is average. So if you're a fast metabolizer, it might be shorter. If you're not so fast and there's other things going on in your system, it could be longer. What about that second standard drink? So for a guy, that's going to take you to 0.045, and it's going to take 4.5 to 5 hours to clear your system. Okay. Your third standard drink, which is equivalent to 2 standard drinks for a female. Okay. So that's going to clear, get to about 0.07, and it's not going to clear your system for at least 6 hours. Okay. So again, we're going to be detecting it using a field breathalyzer for at least 5.5 hours. All right. And then you get your fourth standard drink. Okay, that takes you up to 0.085, and it's going to clear your system in about 7 to 8 hours. All right. So you can understand why the police sort of hang around on the side of the road the morning after grand final. When people have had quite a number of drinks, and they might have finished drinking, say at midnight or something. At 7 a.m. they're on the road and they're driving along, and their peak may have been well above 0.085. All right, if they're a guy, ladies, it might have even been higher, and so consequently the police are still able to detect it. The next morning at sort of 7 in the morning. So that's your sort of issues there that you need to think about. I am aware of a case recently that actually went to court where the gentleman finished drinking 11 standard drinks, so half a bottle of Jack Daniels the night before, and at 7 a.m. the next morning the person was tested, and they discovered in the initial test 0.037, 0.037, and then a second test 20 minutes later, 0.025. So you can see how that sort of tapers off fairly quickly toward the end, but it's still there. And if you've got a 0 alcohol requirement, then yeah, you're over that level. All right, let's talk about the drug testing process. So you'll see here that we're talking about negatives and not negatives. When we're talking about results out in the field, we are never going to refer to positive and negative, all right? For the very reason that, particularly with oral fluid, but even with urine testing, you get all sorts of sort of contaminants and cross reactions and all sorts of things. So what happens out in the field cannot be considered positive. It has to go to the laboratory, has to be analysed in the laboratory, and that's the only way you're going to know if it's positive or not. So there'll be a randomised process for selection of people for testing, and that's going to vary by policy, by agreement with the testing organisation, all of those things. But typically, when a tester arrives on site, they're going to have a conversation with the supervisor on site, and the outcome there is that you'll get assigned a time slot during the test session when you'll be due to come in for a test. What we do ask is that you have nothing to eat or drink 20 minutes prior to testing. When we're talking about oral fluid testing, there's all sorts of contaminants that can sneak into your mouth. If you're having something to eat or drink 20 minutes prior to testing, or smoke, all of those things can contaminate the test. And the difficulty from our perspective is that the Australian standards, the New Zealand standards, don't give us the capacity to just simply stop testing. Okay? Just because we can't get a valid test. We have to keep going until we get what's called a control line on the test, which means it's valid. So once it's valid, then we can actually read the results. Until then, we have to just keep going until we get a result. Okay? So please don't have anything to eat or drink 20 minutes prior to testing. That's really, really important. Otherwise, it's a pain for you as well as for us, because we just got to keep going till we get a result. You'll need to complete some paperwork. Part of that's an informed consent in accordance with the Australian standard, which lists off a heap of things that we need to cover off. If you refuse to consent, that would be considered a refusal under your policy, under your company policy. And that means that then there might be consequences associated with that. So we need to get that paperwork completed. This is the opportunity also for you to declare to us what medications you're on. Now, in our case, our collectors are predominantly medically trained. They're also equipped with information about what cross-reacts. So they're not going to write down things that don't cross-react. So when we're talking about oral fluid testing, typically we're not going to be testing. On occasion we do with certain agreements, but in general, we're not testing for things like Valium. Okay, so if you're on Valium, which is a benzodiazepine, you probably should have a conversation with your boss about that. But certainly from our perspective, if you tell us you're on Valium, what you say in there doesn't get repeated unless it is actually completed on the form. Okay, so if you're taking Valium or some other sort of drug like that and you disclose it to our collector, it's not going to get repeated because it has nothing to do with nothing to do with this this particular form of testing. But if you're on codeine, for example, you're going to get an opiate result. We know it's going to be an opiate result. Disclose that to us. We'll get you to complete a medical declaration form, and you'll be able to go back to work on your own cognizance, so long as you can provide a prescription within 24 hours to show that, yeah, you're on codeine. All right. So that's how that works. We'll then perform the drug screen. So when we're doing the drug screen, it takes about 5 minutes to develop. So we'll get you to sort of do all of that. We'll then put that down and let that develop, and then we'll do an alcohol screen. If both come back negative, we give you a copy of the consent form, which has got a privacy screed on the back. You know, it's the normal stuff you would expect in a privacy thing, how we're going to store your information, what we're going to use it for, and how you can access your results and that sort of thing. So all of that's completed on the back of the form. We've got all of that. We then let you go back to work, and it's all over. There'll be a statistical report that will go through to corporate later in the week, or in the within a few days after the testing, and basically that's the end of the process. You can access your transcript of results at any time, and some people do that when they're moving into another safety sensitive role. It's a process for ensuring that that information can be used for other groups if you choose to. And that would be entirely on you. You can choose to do that. You just need to contact us. We'll send you a encrypted report, and you'll be able to pass that on to other people. I need to be absolutely clear there. We will never, ever pass on that information unless it's by legal subpoena or at your request. So we just don't do that. And we go to great lengths to protect your information. If you do have a positive alcohol screen, so we do refer to alcohol screens as positive, you'll be asked to sit aside for 20 minutes, come back in, we'll perform a second test, and it'll be the lower of those, the lower of those two results will be the result that's actually the result of record, and then you'll be passed over to your supervisor and probably stood down, generally speaking, until you can provide a negative result. There may be consequences under your policy. That's all part of your policy process. But basically, from our perspective, we hand you over to your supervisor and you'll be stood down. When it comes to drug screens, it's a slightly different process because the result that we get in the field is not definitive. It's enough for us to stand you down, or for your employer to stand you down, pending a result from the laboratory, and assuming that it's not related to your medication. If it's related to your medication, you can make a declaration and we can go from there. So you stood down while we send a lab sample off to the lab for confirmation. So the process for actually obtaining that lab sample is that we then do a secondary swab, okay? So it's using a device called a Quantisol device. It's got a medium that protects the sample while it goes to the lab. Oral fluid degrades very quickly, so we need a preservative medium in there. So we do the swab, break it into two, put it into the test tubes. Those are sealed up in your presence. You initial to say they've been sealed. We initial all of those sort of processes. And then they're all packaged up, and that's all sealed as well. And it's sent off to the laboratory through a secure means. When it gets to the laboratory, they need to then examine it, make sure that the seals haven't been broken at each stage before they then break the seals to put that onto the analyzer. The analyzer is a two-stage analyzer, a $500,000 piece of equipment, as opposed to our $25 piece of equipment we're using on site. If I could carry around a $500,000 analyzer on site and perform testing in that regard on site, it'd be awesome. But you don't have the time. We don't have the time. They're a lengthy process. It takes it's a 24-hour generally process to get a result back from the lab. So that process in the lab, we can't replicate it in the field. Hence why we use a screening device in the field. It goes through the two-stage test. It's a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. Basically, just converts your sample into a graph that a toxicologist can confirm. So the toxicologist can actually interpret that for us and provide us with a laboratory report, which is a results confirmation. So that confirmation might be confirmed positive, and it might be confirmed positive consistent with the medication you told us about. You told us that you're taking codeine. It goes back to the lab, and we get codeine and morphine. We know it's codeine. That's fine. So that's a result that would be considered confirmed positive because it confirmed what happened in the field, but it's consistent with declared medicine, and it's therefore treated as, in essence, the same as a negative, but yeah, it's actually, scientifically speaking, a confirmed positive, but consistent with declared meds. It might come back and you told us you're having codeine, but in fact it comes back and we've got 6-acetylmorphine. We know that that little marker, it's only 5 or 6 nanograms per mil, is an indicator for heroin, and it gives us sort of a time frame of about 48 hours just prior to doing the test. So we then can confirm that it's confirmed positive, but it's for an illicit substance, and that report would go back. All of the reports go back in an encrypted fashion, higher level than bank encryption, so pretty solid stuff in that regard. And it's only accessible by the person to whom is authorized to actually read it. The third one is, it's a confirmed negative. So the result we got in the field wasn't confirmed in the laboratory, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. So it can be, the sample degraded on the way to the laboratory. That can happen. If you've got a low-level result, then that's likely what's happened. So it's degraded on the way to the lab. There might be a medication that's undisclosed, and we get a result back that it's created the environment, but it isn't actually the drug. So therefore, it's not a positive for that drug. It's a negative, but it's explainable by the drug that you've taken, which is a medication. Or there's all sorts of other reasons why that might be. So, and the devices do have a very low but potential failure rate as well. So all of those things are sort of in there. The other thing is that we also retain. Remember, I said that we split the sample for the lab into seal up two test tubes. So that second one is what we would call a referral sample. In sporting testing, it's called doping testing. It's called B sample. We refer to it as a referral or referee sample. And in essence, basically, it's there in case you need to appeal the result. If you appeal, it's under section 5.17 of the standard that you appeal, which means it gets sent off to another laboratory of your choice. Has to be NADA accredited, so they have to be accredited to perform the testing. A lot of laboratories, not all of them, are accredited for this. You can identify that from nada.com.au, find a facility, and you'll be able to actually find a laboratory that's accredited. If you do choose to appeal, you're most welcome to do that. Just understand that in doing that, there will be a cost associated with it that may or may not be met by your employer. And that referral analysis under the appeal, all they're looking for is a trace. So because the standard recognises that samples degrade over time, there's a period of time, generally 14 days, for you to appeal. And when that goes off to the new laboratory, they're simply looking for a trace of the drug that was found in the initial instance to confirm that. This is the device we use. It's a ToxWipe device. In other cases, we might use an analyzer or urine cup if we're doing urine testing, but this is specifically around oral fluid testing using a ToxWipe device. First thing we're looking for on the results, so you can see sort of the two panels on the left-hand side there, we're looking for a control test. Okay, so if we get a line there, it means we got enough saliva. We had a case a little while ago with a methamphetamine person. Methamphetamine makes your mouth very dry. We had to go through this process 6 times. Unfortunately, just the reality. So that's those 6 times. We had to keep going until such time as we got our control line. So once you've got a control line, then we know it's a valid sample that we can then analyze and work out what the test results are. Every line, whether it's faint or dark, and it's irrelevant how dark it is or anything along those lines, but so long as we find a line, we know it's a negative result. Okay? So even a faint line doesn't mean that, there's just a little bit of the drug there. It means there's no drug there. Okay? So it's when there is no line, doesn't matter how faint the line is, when there is no line, we know that it is a scientifically positive, but what we would refer to as a negative, not negative result. Okay. As I say, if there's no control line, it's an invalid test and we have to throw it out and start again. All right. I said to you we'd talk about changes in behaviour. This is the area in which we're going to do that. Ultimately, there's a whole heap of reasons why people's behaviours might change. A lot of them are going to actually relate to safety, okay? But not all of them are going to relate to drug use. So you might find somebody who has, I don't know, thick, slurred and incoherent speech. That's probably an indicator of some substance, but it might also mean that the person's got mouth ulcers. Bloodshot, glazed and watery eyes might mean that the person's taken some kind of drug or something. Also might mean they've just sneezed. Um, all of these can be explained in sort of different ways. The important thing is that they trigger you as a co-worker of that person to have a gentle, empathetic conversation with the person and say, hey, I notice you seem a bit under the weather today. I'm just concerned for your welfare. Is there anything I can do to help? It starts the conversation. Are you okay, mate? All of that sort of good, decent stuff that you do. And from there, it might be that you form a conclusion that we've got an issue. And might be someone who's driving a forklift around and they're driving erratically and all the rest of it. You have a conversation with them and you really just can't get any result, any outcome there, and they continue to drive unsafely. It's then time, obviously, to have a conversation with the supervisor and say, hey, look, I'm really concerned about this is what I'm seeing. The supervisor then can intervene and, potentially get the person, out of harm's way. And it might be from there that, the outcomes might be that they get a test, but it might be that they get an ambulance. Okay. And there's a whole range of medical conditions and behavioural matters, some kind of dispute in the home or something along those lines. It's an indicator that somebody needs help. And it's incumbent on you as their co-worker to take that, decent sort of approach to go, hey, look, I'm worried about you. Is there anything I can do for you? All right. Ultimately, yeah, it might lead to, as part of a risk assessment, a drug test, but we're more concerned about getting that person out of harm's way and into safety. Lots of myths. Cannabis cannot show up for 3 months after smoking. Oral fluid, you're typically talking sort of 12 to 24 hours, generally speaking, and can be a lot less than that. In urine, if you're a chronic smoker or chronic user of cannabis, it might show up for 28 days in urine, but not in oral fluid. So, yeah, no, it doesn't show up for 3 months after smoking. Testing's not accurate. I think I've given you a whole heap of information that sort of shows that the system itself, by the time you add in the laboratory processes, it's very accurate. In the field, yeah, look, I can see that people might feel that it's not accurate, but I think there's a whole heap of context around that, around cross-reactivity, the fact that oral fluid has all sorts of substances in there, all those sort of things. So, yeah, testing is accurate, but you've got to look at the overall process. Can you be affected by passive smoking? Yeah, you probably can. There's a couple of studies out there that sort of show that you don't get very high peaks from passive smoking. And ultimately, can I detect when you don't have a very high peak? No, I can't. So ultimately, for cannabis, for example, you shouldn't be sort of showing in an oral fluid test. Generally speaking, passive smoking, you'll peak out around about that sort of 1 to 2 nanograms per mil, and I'm testing at 15 nanograms and up. Okay, so generally speaking, it's not going to be, well, I can say that you're not going to be tested positive or not negative in the field for passive smoke. Masking agents can't be detected. That's what we do, is we actually identify masking agents, and there's we see them all the time for all sorts of things. The 3 predominant ones used around oral fluid that I'm aware of, one is like a saliva stimulant pad. You chuck it in your mouth and it stimulates saliva in your mouth. Well, I'm testing for saliva, so that's actually a good thing for us. I've had people who try to bite down on the device to try and sort of stop the fluid from running, I guess. Ultimately, no, that doesn't work. We've tested that numerous times. And the other one is, and this is really gross, and I hope you're not around when you're eating. I'm aware of a person who, we would screen him for amphetamine, get an amphetamine result. would then set up for the lab sample. In the meantime, by sort of subterfuge, he'd slip a capsule into his mouth. Wouldn't be able to do that these days. This is under the old standard where we weren't permitted to check the oral cavity. Now we're required to. But yeah, just before doing the test, he'd bite down and the capsule had someone else's saliva in it. Pretty gross. And ultimately, we got him eventually. He couldn't help but brag about it. So it came back to us through other employees, and yeah, that was the outcome. But it's not going to stop the actual overall test. And our suspicions were heightened. So, does the test result equal impairment? No, it doesn't. Scientifically, there's no reliable way to test for impairment. So what we're testing for is whether you exceed the levels that are in the Australian standard. It's a bit like on the side of the road. Are you magically not impaired at 0.049 and impaired at 0.05? No, it differs for everybody, but there's a level that is set. So these levels are set in the Australian standard. If you exceed those levels, you consider to have a positive result, and the outcome is that there's a breach of policy takes place, and there's consequences for that. Detection periods when it comes to drugs are obviously going to be much more difficult than they are for alcohol. The simple reality is that there's no labelling system. You don't find a joint, a cannabis joint that's got one standard joint on the side of it, a line of speed or cocaine or whatever. And the strength of the drug itself can actually vary enormously. So what I can give you is some broad sort of numbers and information here. Certainly jump on our website. We've got various articles that kind of explore this in more detail. But fundamentally, it's going to depend on the amount that you consume, what's your health, your metabolic rate, that sort of thing. How did you take the drug? Did you eat it in a cookie? Did you smoke it? Did you inject it, snort it, whatever? So that can affect how long it stays in your system. And what cutoff levels use. So we use the cutoff levels that are in the Australian standard as is appropriate, or Australian New Zealand standard. If you're importing something from the United States, they've got totally different levels, and so they're not going to be the same devices. So don't do that. Buy Australian devices or New Zealand devices. So roughly speaking, methamphetamines will be in your system for between 1 and 3 days. Amphetamines up to about 10 hours. Heroin and morphine, your opiates, they'll be in your systems for up to 2 days. Oxycodone up to 2 days. Cocaine and its metabolites, as I say, 2 hours roughly for cocaine. Its metabolites, benzoylecgonine in particular, it's around 3 days. And then cannabis, we're saying up to 24 hours. It's probably more around that sort of 12 to 16 hours, but certainly for safety's sake, up to 24 hours. All right. If somebody in your workplace goes off for a test and they don't come back, it's not cool to start rumours and gossip. It's inappropriate. It's the quickest way to destroy trust in your workplace. Don't do it. So don't start rumours and gossip. Just simply, maintain people's privacy. You're never going to hear from us what the result was. The supervisor will hear, and obviously the corporate area, as is appropriate, and only limited to specific people within those groups. And that's simply how it is. So please don't start rumours and gossip. If somebody tells you they know what happened, well, they certainly didn't hear it from us. Okay, so just be careful on that front. And some workplaces are smaller than others, you might actually get to hear what's happened. Okay, not from us, as I say, but somebody doesn't come back to work, or there's something else going on. If you become aware, treat that person with respect, give them dignity and support. The reality is that they're just a human being who's made a mistake, and people make mistakes all the time. So please don't treat them any differently. They're somebody who needs a bit of support, and they're still entitled to dignity. The organisations generally will acknowledge that and understand that, and so they have in place employee assistance programs. Make sure you access them as you need to. This is once again, is not around moral or legal judgments. We're not going to report this to the police. We're not interested in that sort of thing. Our only interest is safety. All right, safety of the worker, safety of their workmates, and safety of the general public. So that's our focus. That's our interest. Look out for your mates. Keep an eye out for, behaviour changes and have conversations. Are you okay, mate? Is there anything I can do for you? That's really, really important. And then ultimately, I've given you a heap of information. Please use that information to educate others. So particularly around, P platers and that sort of thing, as far as how long it takes for alcohol to get out of your system, it's so easy to make that mistake. Look after yourselves, look after others. As I say, you are most welcome to access our website and go to the inquiries page and lodge any inquiry you'd like to lodge. And I'm happy to respond personally or have one of my team respond to those queries. Have a great day. Thank you very much for your time today, and hope to talk to you soon.